The China-US technology battle. What are the stakes and what does the future look like? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. China and the United States are now engaged in a major competition in what's being called a high-tech race. From smartphones to robots, from artificial intelligence to quantum computing to electronic vehicles. Both countries are moving ahead at speed. For a look at how they're doing, we begin with this report from CGTN's Mark New in California.
With high-powered companies like Amazon, Google, and Facebook, the U.S. has long held the top position in artificial intelligence. But the author of The Digital War, Winston Ma, says China and the U.S. are now neck and neck when it comes to the number of leading AI researchers and influential research papers on the topic.
In China, we're talking about 1 billion internet users. Every day, they're leaving extraordinary amount of data on the internet platforms. So for the Chinese internet giants, as well as the new unicorns, they have a huge amount of data to work on for their AI developments.
The global tech competition is often mired in politics, but Ma believes U.S. sanctions against Chinese companies like Huawei have produced an unexpected result.
And certainly, Huawei took a hit and its smartphone market share has decreased dramatically. But the flip side of that story is that, that market share did not go to the U.S. brands, did not go to the Apple's market share. Instead, the Chinese brands filled that void, especially Xiaomi. When you look at the top 5 smartphone brands globally, 3 Chinese brands, including Xiaomi, are there.
Technological advances in ultra-fast quantum computing could someday help us better predict everything from the weather to financial markets. China recently claimed to have developed the world's fastest quantum computer.
Well, China's got the fastest quantum computer, but it's for one use case. So the quantum side, the U.S. is ahead. You've got companies like Honeywell and IBM and Google and Microsoft running into this quantum space. And it's not just the fact that it's a performance issue. They've got the ecosystem of developers. They've got the ecosystem of folks that are building products and solutions on top that's much more powerful.
Another powerful race shaping up is over electric vehicles. While the U.S. is out in front in some areas, it could be losing ground in others.
The United States are pretty much a leader when it comes to the renaissance of the EV, the electric vehicle, namely because of one company, Tesla, that started this 10 years ago and has been pretty successful at this. However, if you look at different regions in the world, in particular China and Western Europe, you see those two regions really picking up speed, and particularly also adoption rates of electric vehicles. And the United States is at a risk to kind of fall behind.
EV market expansion also depends on how easy it is for drivers to charge up. Some auto experts say in that area, China is better positioned to succeed. Installing charging networks is expensive, and it's not easy to find a centralized location. So while EV companies continue to innovate, government investment is also seen as being key in accelerating growth. Mark New, CGTN, Palo Alto, California.
Well, let's bring in our panel now to weigh in on all of this. Joining me from Beijing is Andy Mok. He is a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Also joining us from San Francisco is Rui Ma. She is the creator and host of TechBuzz China. With us too from Detroit is Peter Suchu. He writes about technology and is a contributor to Forbes magazine. And also joining us from Beijing is Xindo Xu. He is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution and he's the host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And Rui Ma, let me start with you. As we just heard in our report there, both sides are claiming progress in this battle for technological supremacy. But what is your view on the overall state of the China-US technology competition that's taking place right now?
I would agree with a lot of the comments that have been made. In particular, earlier the presenter was saying how some of the sanctions, right, against Chinese tech companies have inadvertently created a market for Chinese tech, because previously they could rely on the more advanced supply chain technologies from the United States, but now having been slapped with sanctions, now there's this fear that, oh, we need to have self-reliance, we need to have not interdependent supply chains, we need to have an independent supply chain that we can rely on. And this has, in fact, created more capital and more talent as people see more and more opportunities to make advancements in this space where the U.S. was previously leading, and China now has more of an existential crisis and needs to solve this problem of technological interdependency.
So, Rima, would you say then that these sanctions against a company like, say, Huawei has backfired really because it's motivated Chinese companies to develop their own technology?
Well, I would say it's a little early to say, but it certainly has created the dynamic that I just explained, where, again, China is still behind in a lot of these technologies, so it will take years to catch up, but the ecosystem is probably accelerating at a pace that it previously could not accommodate.
Andy Mok, one of the biggest developments we've had in technology in the last decade or so is electric vehicles, and of course all the technology that's associated with electric vehicles. They talk about navigation technology, connectivity, battery technology, things like that. China is the world's largest auto market. How well is China doing in this particular sector, and where do you think it's going to go to from here?
Well, I think China is very well positioned to be a global leader in this field. Everything from key components like batteries, which China is a leader in, to the end users. So in the package, we heard the importance of charging stations. And I think one underappreciated factor is the role of regulation. And in China, we all know that if the central government makes a decision, even down to the neighborhood level, the decisions are implemented. Whereas in a place like the United States, it may be actually impossible for the federal government to make a decision that is uniformly implemented across the country on a timely basis. So I think this is one of the critical factors for the universal adoption of electric vehicles. And of course, once you have a system operating, that gives you advantages in learning how to develop and further optimize it. And I would go back also to Ray's point here that this was a tremendously galvanizing moment for China, and the U.S. sanctions, I think, truly backfired and created this Sputnik moment for the Chinese government and many Chinese tech companies to say, it'd be nice to have our own semiconductors, but we also like inexpensive, high-quality American chips from Qualcomm, from NVIDIA, et cetera. But now these sanctions have really put this issue at the very top of the policy stack for China. So I think the country is completely aligned, just saying they have to do something about this. And it really is to the detriment of major American tech companies and American competitiveness.
So, Andy, that point on charging stations, what that could mean for the United States, of course, is that you could make and manufacture electric vehicles, but if you don't have that infrastructure in place, and at this stage the country does not have enough of that infrastructure in place. In fact, there's quite a bit of money earmarked in the current bill sitting in Congress to build out an infrastructure for electric vehicles. But if you don't have that, you're going to be held back, aren't you?
Absolutely. And again, this is where I think China excels at these systemic revolutionary type changes. We all know the example of high-speed rail, but we need to understand here too that the U.S. fundamentally misread the technology revolution. We go back to what President Bill Clinton said very famously, that China trying to control the internet would be like nailing Jell-O to the wall. And not only did it turn out to be possible to nail Jell-O to the wall, but it turned out to be absolutely critical. And China realized this through what is sometimes referred to as the Great Firewall. And similarly, what we're seeing today is China's not only advancing on the technology front, but on the regulatory front as well. So we're seeing the cybersecurity law this year, the data security law, the personal information protection law. That China is approaching this systematically and in an integrated fashion. And I think this really is the best way to realize the fruits of technological innovation, whether we're talking about EV, AI, quantum, while avoiding the risks as well, which and they're very, very significant risks, as we've seen too.
Peter, you are in Detroit, which has traditionally been the home of the U.S. automobile industry, Motor Town, as it used to be known. But it's California-based Tesla, which has now taken the lead in the manufacture and sales of electric vehicles. What's the view from Detroit on the EV revolution that we're seeing right now?
Well, I don't think it's just Detroit. I think it's what we would call the flyovers. For 18 years of my life, I lived in New York City. I spent a lot of time in California. And I think what we see on both coasts in the country is how out of touch the coasts are with Middle America, which is where I am now. All of my neighbors here in the Detroit suburbs have big trucks. This is what they want. They want it for safety. They want it for the trip to Home Depot. They want it because it drives well in the wintertime. Until we can see EV trucks coming, and I know Ford has their F-150 filling that void, until we can see trucks, I think it's going to be a real hard sell outside of the coasts. The same way that we're seeing kind of that hold up with self-driving cars. Self-driving cars are great in the Bay Area where weather is the same 365 a year, but once you get into things like snow and ice and rainstorms, it doesn't work quite as well.
And there seems to be, Peter, something of a close attachment that American drivers have to gas-driven vehicles. It's almost an emotional attachment. They want gas-driven vehicles, as you point out, especially in Middle America. How difficult is it going to be to persuade people to give up those gas-driven vehicles and adopt electric vehicles?
Right now, we're seeing gas prices on the rise. They fell to, well, I wouldn't say record levels, but they fell to near record levels a year ago during the pandemic, year and a half ago during the pandemic. Those prices have steadily been on the rise. I saw a AAA report just this week. Michigan, where I'm located, has the highest gas prices in more than a decade. So I think that's going to be the factor, is how expensive it is to use those gas-guzzling vehicles. When we reach a tipping point and it's too expensive to fuel up your truck, we might see a transition. But again, the infrastructure is going to be that issue. As somebody who has literally driven coast to coast, you know, you can find a gas station in Kansas, you can find a gas station in Iowa. You know, you run low on gas, you're in a little bit of trouble on some places, but you're going to find a gas station. What do you do right now with electric vehicles where maybe you can't make it from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, you know, let alone Pittsburgh to Phoenix?
Xindo Xu, and of course, whenever we have this kind of technology battle between China and the United States, politics is not far behind. In fact, the United States has made it very clear that it will not tolerate China surpassing its goals in technology. We heard that from President Biden. In fact, in one of his first speeches since becoming president, he said, "Not on my watch." So how does China view this, and does it impact Chinese tech goals in any way?
Well, you know, for China, it's really, you know, it has a big market. Remember back in like 10, 15 years ago, you know, we read stories, it's all about why the Chinese can't innovate. And nowadays people are afraid of like, Chinese innovation power. So it's a lack of understanding. I think it's also a lack of understanding about Chinese politics, about Chinese, you know, how Chinese view itself in terms of the global situation. For example, China does not have this goal, you know, to dominate the world. It's really about take care of itself, you know, doing a much better job than yesterday. That's a goal. Even when it comes to competition, you know, right now, if you look at China, it stresses very much about the renewable energy. For example, basically, almost one third of the renewable energy patents comes from China. It produces, it exports the largest, I think, in terms of wind turbines, you know, solar panels, EVs, and batteries. So China does not see that as a competition to beat the U.S. China sees that as a solution to solve its pollution issue, to fight climate change. That's very, very important. And when it comes to semiconductor, it's a different issue because for a lot of Chinese, people don't realize that there's heavy reliance on semiconductor, on the U.S. technology, for example, or technology from Netherlands. But until the sanctions, are imposed on Huawei, and there's a wake-up call, we have to do something. Otherwise, basically, you will do, like a Huawei, the high-end phone will be out of the market simply because of the cutting off of the technology or supply of the semiconductor products from the U.S. Now it's a wake-up call, and then the governments, the business, and the public in general, they are doing something, to improve our own technology in terms of producing a semiconductor. That's probably the backfire. We don't know, where it will lead. Tech war, just like any kind of war, it's easy to start, but it's difficult to manage, to manage where it will lead, the direction.
Rui Ma, let's look at the Chinese smartphone industry, 5G technology industry as well. I mean, if you look at the West, Apple and Samsung are very popular in Western countries. But if you look at other parts of the world, like Africa or Asia, it's Chinese brands which are selling in those countries as well. What does the future hold for smartphone development in China?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that even since a couple years ago that the domestic market has basically reached saturation. And, all the smartphone makers have been actively seeking growth outside of China. So India, and Africa, Middle East being very good markets and where Chinese brands have done really well. I think different from what I guess Huawei actually being one of the exceptions is most of these other brands have primarily been able to win through cheaper prices and been able to basically have their phones, be sold in developing countries where people just don't have as deep of the pocketbooks that we have here in the West. And as for the future, I think that I don't know about the smartphone companies in particular, but what I do know from talking to a lot of Chinese tech companies, early and late stage, is that all of them are seeking to have a global presence, right? So I don't think that's going to stop. Whether or not that means, they'll be actively trying to take away market share from even the high-end devices like Apple and Samsung, I think that could happen, but I don't know what is exactly on the horizon.
Andy, Mark, of course, this particular sector, smartphone development, smartphone manufacturing, is fraught with all kinds of risks. We saw that when the United States cut off semiconductor supplies to Chinese companies, Huawei in particular. If we look at Huawei, for instance, to what extent did it hurt the company, and how are other smartphone companies doing?
Well, I think these sanctions absolutely hurt Huawei because they were directly tailored to inflict as much damage on the company as possible, because it is China's technological champion, and I think a template for what China's tech future will look like, meaning that, of course, China's manufacturing miracle was based on low value add, labor intensive products that were sold inexpensively. But Huawei was really the first company to invest significantly in R&D, develop its own technology, and compete as a technology company. So this really was very damaging to Huawei. But on the other hand, I think it also showed the resilience and just the toughness of Huawei to respond, to do what it takes to keep going. So I think that what we will see is it's not just Huawei. Look at TikTok now, Douyin, as the first truly global Chinese company on the consumer markets, which figured out a way to reach global markets at scale. So I think that the Chinese tech advance is really unstoppable, and that whatever the U.S. is doing really either backfires or hurts itself much more than does China. I'll throw in a quick example, too. Just recently, the Pentagon's chief software officer resigned because he was so frustrated with the pace of innovation in the U.S. military. So, again, we see that there are systemic constraints on the U.S.'s ability to keep pace, despite whatever the rhetoric we might hear from the White House or other parts of the U.S. government.
Peter, let's move on to artificial intelligence, or AI as it's known. It's another area of very intense competition between these two countries. In fact, just as we heard there from Winston Ma in that report at the beginning of the show, the two countries are neck and neck. But how far advanced is the United States AI industry right now?
Well, right now, I would say that China stands as a full spectrum peer competitor of the United States in both commercial and national security applications for AI. The United States has certainly gone all in on a number of sectors with artificial intelligence. We're seeing it again with the self-driving cars I referenced before. We're seeing the military applications. I think the United States has the edge because the United States has the edge in software development right now. But right now, I could see China closing that gap very quickly.
Andy Mok, how is China poised to use AI in the country? Will this technology be used to improve people's lives?
Certainly. And I think that artificial intelligence, the best way we can understand AI is that it's a general purpose technology like electricity. So we think about pre-industrial revolution, post-industrial revolution, the impact that technology had on consumers' lives, having lights at home dramatically changed people's daily lives, to industrial applications. It enabled much more productivity from factories to the military. And similarly, we're seeing the same thing with artificial intelligence, which is, again, I think why it is the nexus of competition between the US and China. And here we also see China taking a strategic and comprehensive approach. We've all heard that data is quote unquote the new oil, meaning that it powers everything in AI, which is true. But another very important aspect of the competition is just computing performance, which we can think of as hardware. And a recent report that was released by a Chinese think tank affiliated with MIIT just announced that China has something like 135 exaflops, so meaning the ability to process 135 quintillion floating point operations per second. So this is an enormous increase. The US still leads in this area. I think in total global computing power, they're about 36%. China's at 31%. But if we break that down into basic computing, smart computing, and supercomputing capacity, China's actually well in the lead in smart computing capacity. So again, I think the ability to make these systemic investments, whether it's regulatory investments, capital investments, or investment in talent and manpower. I think China's unique system of governance gives it some important advantages.
Xindo Xu, looking at the competition between China and the United States in technology, the United States has complained very often that it's not a level playing field, that Chinese companies receive subsidies from the Chinese government. Is that a fair criticism?
Well, every government does subsidy to the certain, technology, certain industry. If you look at the U.S., it's more or less the same. Of course, for the Chinese system, probably you see there's more. It's a planned system at a certain level. But it's a combination probably. You have a planning the factor. You have this invisible hand of the market. So once they combine perfectly, you will see there's a great development in terms of speed, in terms of innovation. But it's not always work that way. But I would not say as long as it works, if you are pragmatic, as long as it works for developing countries to catch up in terms of technology, what else can you do? You cannot steal, you cannot, or otherwise you can always copy and to do the follow-up. So you have to start somewhere. I wouldn't say that's unfair, in particular for a developing country. It's really about the, otherwise the developed world would say, all our technologies is copyrighted, and the developing countries were always behind. They can never catch up with us. So subsidy is not really a bad thing in that sense.
Okay. Rui Ma, another field that we hear a lot of talk about is quantum computing. Firstly, for the uninitiated, like myself and many others, what is quantum computing and how does it impact our lives?
Well, quantum computing is a new form of computing that I think we haven't figured out exactly how it's going to be used in daily life. It is primarily now in academic and research, and it's a fundamentally new and different technology from the semiconductors that we're using today. It's entirely different technology. I'm actually not the best person to talk about this, but I think what everyone is hoping in the tech space is that this will represent the next stage of development where we're no longer, because we're already at the edge of Moore's law. I think people have heard about this, the semiconductor companies getting slower and slower in their advancements in terms of how narrow they can make the channels on the chips, and that this will open up a whole new type of computing power to mankind.
Andy Mok, where is this quantum computing competition right now?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the answer is no one really knows, because quantum is seen, perhaps even more than AI, as a strategic technology from a national security military perspective. And for this reason, a lot of the research that is done is classified and not publicized. So I think it's hard to know. But that being said, there is a race on for this. And my understanding of quantum is that classic computing is based on zeros and ones, so bits. And what quantum does is it gives you many, many more possibilities, and as a result, gives you a quantum leap in terms of the ability to process difficult problems. Some of the classic ones are nuclear explosions, weather patterns, the stock market, etc. So we think about things like, what if, through quantum computing, we could accurately predict stock prices a week, a month from now? So these are the kinds of applications that are possible that I think make it so promising and so exciting, but it's also threatening when we look at it in the context of a geopolitical rivalry.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. You've been watching The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for being with us.